Hi everybody, I'm Susan Gray, your host for this edition of Book Talk. Today we're talking with Lewis Cantor about his new book, Dewey and Elvis, The Life and Times of a Rock and Roll DJ. Welcome, Lewis, and thanks for coming.
Thanks so much.
Lewis Cantor is Professor Emeritus of History at Indiana University, but don't let that throw you. He now lives in Memphis, Tennessee, and is the author of Wheelin on Beale, How WDIA Became the Nation's First All-Black Radio Station and Created the Sound That Changed America, possibly the longest title I've ever read. And he also wrote A Prologue to the Protest Movement, the Missouri Sharecropper Roadside Demonstration of 1939, which was made into an award-winning documentary film. He grew up in Memphis and, of course, went to Humes High with Elvis Presley. You got some Elvis Presley stories about Humes High?
Oh, all sorts of stories. Actually, he was a year behind me. I knew him mostly through George Klein. George and I were real close friends, and of course, George was president of the senior class at Humes when Elvis graduated, and George was always held in very high esteem by Elvis. Even after Elvis became Elvis, George was still the president of the senior class. So I used George to bring Elvis down to a show, to a Goodwill Review, which the radio station put on. And I hadn't seen him since high school days. And of course, he'd hit really big since then. And he remembered me, he was very friendly, and he was, all those stories about him I think are true. He was a really nice person.
Right. Your book is not only fun to read, but you really give a multi-layered account of the Memphis's contribution to music history. Start out by describing the backstory, the backdrop of the Memphis music scene just before Dewey Phillips became the most popular white DJ to play all black music.
Well, he comes on the air in 1949. He's on the air for 5 full years before Elvis ever hit. It started, of course, with WDIA in Memphis. WDIA was the first all-black radio station in the United States. They come on the air in October of 1948. They broke the color barrier in the South. Before WDIA, no one had programmed for that black audience. And of course, they were enormously successful. Their ratings just went off the charts. And this was a zero-sum game. As the ratings went up for WDIA, they came down for everybody else. And so Memphis at that time was already, by 1950, Memphis was already about 40% African American. No one was programming for that audience, and so everybody wanted to get a piece of the pie then.
Sure.
So WDIA was a dawn to dusk station. That means that it went off the air when the sun went down. And in the wintertime, that was about 5 o'clock. So WHBQ, which was the vehicle that carried Dewey's voice, WHBQ decided that they would try to put on a white announcer in the evening after WDIA signed off to try to capture some of that black audience. And that's what Dewey was all about initially. That's why he was put on the air. And they put Dewey on the air, and of course the rest, as they say, is history. He not only captured the black audience, he won the hearts and the souls of all the white teenagers as well, and became the hottest DJ in the Mid-South.
Right. Well, now, he was called Memphis's Wolfman Jack, and later the Southern Fried Howard Stern, which kind of gives me mixed feelings. Lewis, we know who Elvis is, but who was Daddy-O-Dewey Phillips?
Daddy-O-Dewey. Well, he was kind of both of those people. The Howard Stern thing, I think, is a bit harsh. He was a wild man for sure, and he never really, when compared with Howard Stern, I'd say he's a kind of a mild-mannered Boy Scout. He didn't use the four-lettered words. He didn't, he used everything by double entendres and that sort of thing. But he was also just a nice guy, too, and apparently was responsible for not only assisting Elvis, but for a great many people that he broke into radio at that time. He helped launch the careers of not only Elvis, but Johnny Cash and Jerry Lee Lewis, and just a whole slew of people, Carl Perkins, Roy Orbison. I think that, and he was the first, he's really important, I think. Most Elvis fans know Dewey exclusively as the guy who played Elvis's first record and conducted that now famous first on-the-air interview. But what they don't know is the enormous contribution that Dewey made to the rock and roll revolution. I think he made really two significant big changes. One was he really started playing what was then described as race music in 1948-49 when he comes on the air. They simply weren't playing it. And Dewey is in there and plays it long before Alan Freed, who has the reputation of discovering rock and roll. Alan Freed was still playing classical music in Cleveland when Dewey comes on the air. Alan Freed didn't go to WINS in New York City until about 1954. So Dewey is already playing all the guys. He's playing Howlin Wolf and Muddy Waters and T-Bone Walker and B.B. King and everybody else long before Alan Freed. So he sort of conditioned the listening audience for someone like Elvis to come along. He really legitimizes the black sound for the white audience. Yes. He makes it acceptable. Right. White people were not listening to race music. It was unacceptable.
What were they listening to, just as a contrast to what Dewey was playing? On the rest of the stations, they were playing things like Perry
Como and Eddie Fisher and How Much Is That Doggy in the Window and things like that.
That's my favorite.
So it was very, very traditional music, and so it took, I think, that to kind of make that transition and make the music more acceptable. The other thing that's most important about Dewey, I think, that I try to emphasize in the book, is that he was responsible to a large extent for really launching Elvis's career. It's very difficult for people today, especially Elvis fans, to come to the realization that there was a time when Elvis was not very well known and had a kind of a hard time making it in the beginning.
Because he was different.
He was different.
He was different.
Sam Phillips says, you know, Elvis, how does he say it? He was a different kind of animal on the air. People had never heard anything quite like him. Sam's story, now incidentally, Sam and Dewey were not related. Sam Phillips and Dewey Phillips just had the same last name. They actually told people that they were related to confuse matters more, and everybody thought they were, but they were not. But Sam Phillips, the man who discovered Elvis, tells this story. He says that when he made the first big record, That's All Right Mama, Sam takes that record out into what he used to describe as the Dust Bowl circuit. Actually a misnomer, because he was going down into Alabama, Mississippi, maybe Florida, that area. Sam was his own A&R man. That means that he promoted his own records. He was a one-man operation. He literally would take his records, in this case Elvis's first recording, throw it in the trunk of his car, and take off and go out on the circuit. He would hit the disc jockeys. And his version of this is this. He went to the traditional disc jockeys, the regular disc jockeys. They wouldn't play Elvis, he said, because they thought Elvis sounded too black. Mm-hmm. He went to the black disc jockeys, and they didn't want to play Elvis because he sounded too country. Oh, he comes back to Memphis only to discover that it's Dewey Phillips who has really gotten Elvis very, very hot in Memphis. And of course, it's Dewey who really almost becomes evangelical about him, promoting him not just on the air, but also he had sock hops. He took him around to high schools to speak. And Elvis wasn't real sure he was going to make it easier. The point I make in the book is that he refused to quit his day job. He was still working, driving that truck for, what was it, RC Crown or something?
Tasty Bakery or something.
And I think it was RC Crown. But anyway, he was still doing that because he didn't know for sure that he was going to make it. So, of course, every Elvis fan is going to say Elvis would have made it without Dewey, and I certainly wouldn't.
When you think about the times, that's not necessarily.
He had an enormous talent, and of course he probably would have, but in fact there was that period when folks weren't sure.
Right, right. Well, I'm going to talk about Sam Phillips a little bit later, and incidentally, the story I thought was the funniest was that Dewey Phillips' own kids thought that Sam Phillips was their uncle. Yeah. So then when their parents tried to say, no, we didn't really mean it like that, they were very upset and even cried about, stop saying that about Uncle Sam. So that was funny.
Yeah.
I want to get back to the period of the 50s, which was his heyday. That censorship was Big Brother pretty much back then. Yeah. And there were things that you couldn't do, and they were watching you all the time, and they were watching Dewey continuously because he was just pretty much a magnet for the censors to go, uh-oh, we've got trouble. And Dewey purposefully would go up to the line and sit there on the censorship just to make the censors nutty.
Right. He always kind of walked that line. He was a kind of a wild man. He was unconventional, I guess would be the word that you want to use to describe him. He comes on the air, of course, without any kind of training whatsoever. None whatsoever. He's totally unprofessional, and it still kind of staggers the mind to realize that here is a person put on the air in a major radio market on a radio station that had a tremendous following at that particular time with absolutely no training whatsoever.
Right.
And he, of course, couldn't even read a commercial. They gave him, George Klein worked, incidentally, George who a great many Memphians know as a radio and television entertainer in his own right. George broke into radio back then as Dewey's gopher. He was the guy that brought Dewey his coffee and answered the telegrams and that sort of thing. And George was mostly responsible for passing along a lot of the stories. He was very helpful to me in writing the book, passing along a lot of the stories about Dewey in those early days. But it was George who's primarily responsible for making the connection between Dewey and Elvis. George was president of the senior class, knew Elvis very well, very close friend, still is the person responsible for holding the memorial for him every year. And George was able to really be the liaison between Dewey and Elvis. Now, Dewey and Elvis would have gotten along wonderfully well, I think, without George, but they were quite a threesome, and there's some nice stories in the book about those three running around together. George told me some
wonderful stories. Well, I want you, when I read what Dewey was like on the air, it made me nervous, and there wasn't even a show going on. So I want you to describe his on-air, if you were standing outside of his booth watching him do a show, what would you be seeing?
Well, Lord, he was very, first of all, he was...
what was the name of his show first?
Red Hot and Blue.
Red Hot and Blue.
And of course, he was responsible also for a great many sayings. People had all these sayings, the most famous of which was tell him Phillips sent you.
Right.
Tell him Phillips sent you. And that one became so popular that everybody thought of a great many variations on it, and the best story probably, professional historians say these stories get so good they're probably apocryphal, but the one story that passed around a lot was some woman who got very upset with her husband one night and apparently used a knife on him, and the hospital, the ambulance came to pick him up, and she said, now take him to the hospital and tell him Philip sent you.
Scandalous.
But to get back to your censorship thing, he was very, he exercised himself quite a bit, and while he was on the air, you'd have seen him looking like he was going to be ricocheting off the wall.
Yeah.
He would not, when he interviewed someone, like our interview here
Right.
is we're on microphone and everything. Dewey's favorite,
well-mannered and whatnot.
Dewey's favorite was to holler at whoever was in the studio. Somebody would be in the studio walking around, and he'd just kind of point the mic at them and have a big conversation with them across the room. He would yank the arm off the record if he didn't like it, just screech it across the record.
And that is a totally unique sound, and when it's loud.
That's right. And he would turn the sound up. He'd put the arm on the record, let it drop, and you'd get the first early sounds as it made it around the grooves before anything came in. He would just be talking constantly. He'd pick up something he didn't like, put it back down. So all this unconventionality.
Threw records when he was done with them, or if he didn't like them, he just threw them in a trunk across the...
And I think that all that unconventionality was a part of his charm. I mean, I think that's what attracted people to him. They didn't want to hear the radio announcer.
Right.
You've got to remember that this is 1949. Radio announcers, when they came on the air, were supposed to sound like radio announcers. They were supposed to speak in these deep resonant tones and articulate every sentence, and of course Dewey could hardly read. George Klein said that they used to do fact sheets. In other words, they'd give him 3 or 4 facts and he would just ad-lib the entire commercial. They didn't want him reading the commercial.
Well, he was the ad-lib guy. That was pretty much his style.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And he made Falstaff beer, which was one of his favorite sponsors, famous with phrases like, if you can't drink it, freeze it, knead it, and if you can't eat it, open up a rib and pour it in, and things like that. And those are the kinds of things that people remembered. So I'm sure that Herb Sadler, who was the distributor for Falstaff in Memphis, was perfectly delighted with Dewey doing that without him having to read the commercial.
Right. Well, now, Daddy-O-Dewey Phillips was a self-promoter, and when you said he was evangelical about Elvis's music, if he loved the song or the sound, he completely promoted it just out of sheer passion.
Exactly.
Which is such a great part of the American success story, if you can call it that. How did the two characteristics of being a music promoter and a self-promoter come into play at Grant's Five and Dime on Beale Street, which was just such a great story? You will love this story.
Well, he worked down at Grant's. Actually, that's how he started. He had the record department at Grant's.
Street.
On Beale. Well, actually, not on Beale. It was on Main. Yeah.
Okay.
Right next to it. Well, about a block from Beale Street. That's what got him on the WHBQ, because he was in Grant's, which was on the corner. What is that little corner? Gayoso, which separated Grant's from what was Goldsmith's, today Macy's, right on Main Street. And he would come out of the side door of Grant's and cross that street, go over one store from Goldsmith's, was the Hotel Gayoso, where the WHBQ studios were. Right. So he constantly worried Gordon Lawhead, who was the program director at WHBQ, to get himself on the air. He'd come out practically every day and come up there and want to get on the air. But while he was at Grant's, he had the record department. People tell me all sorts of stories, and after a while, you're not sure. Yeah, you're not sure which ones are absolutely right. But I do gather from most of them that apparently what happened was he had something like a platform rigged up in which he had turntables and a microphone. He sort of co-opted the microphone that was used to make announcements within the store.
I can't believe he did it.
Yeah, you know how we got 2 for 50-cent handkerchiefs or something. Blue light special. So he sets this whole thing up, and he is, in essence, he's an announcer without a radio station. He's doing what a regular announcer does.
The boy couldn't help himself.
Yeah, so he had the whole thing done before he ever got hired by WHBQ, and I think that's the reason why Gordon Lawhead put him on, because he could go down to Grant's and saw the audience that he'd captivated. People came in, they couldn't believe he was already pulling people off of Beale Street over to Grant's, which was about a block off Beale, to come out and check out the show. He already had an audience before he went on the air. And I think really that's how he got in touch with the black community so much. Everybody always wants to know immediately, here's a white guy who somehow felt comfortable on Beale Street. Everyone wants to know, how in the world did he do that? And I think that some of that was because that audience was already coming in. He was first playing the music. He
loved the R&B sound and just stayed on it.
That was it. He had the love for the rhythm and blues music, and I think that's what made him feel comfortable with the black people. Black people felt comfortable with him, and for that reason, I think he was already well known in the black community while he was at Grant's. And of course, once he got on the air, Dot Phillips, his widow, who incidentally just recently passed away within the last couple of months, told me wonderful stories about him. She said, you'd go down Beale Street with Dewey, and you'd think he was the mayor of the town.
Right. She met him at Grant's.
She'd meet him at Grant's, that's right. That's where they got together.
Love story.
Right across the street. She went in to hear him sing. He was quite a singer. He liked to sing along with the song sometimes. And he actually went, I found out, to what was called the Memphis College of Music, which apparently is that huge, beautiful house there on McLean, right at Overton Park, and which Rhodes College took over, Rhodes University took over, and apparently attended it for quite a while, trying to learn how to sing, but his real métier turned out to be not singing, but announcing, of course, and switched off to that.
Right, so Dewey's at Grant's, and he's the only guy now visiting Beale Street regularly, and somehow has insinuated himself in there, and everybody down there is fine with it, because that was the black, I don't know, congregating place, kind of? How would you describe it back then? Yeah,
sort of.
That was sort of their turf, and so if you weren't white, you didn't go down there, but he went down there and had the best time, and they loved him. You know what, when you described Beale Street back then, it was really kind of a shocking description, because the thing about I don't know if this is just a rumor, but they had to have I don't know what you call it, some sort of wagon to pick up the...
That one is definitely a rumor, yeah. Pick up the dead bodies.
Because I thought, oh my goodness, all that violence down on Beale Street, and now it's Party Central. So.
Yeah, what is it? Handy said Beale Street never closed until somebody got killed, but I don't think it was quite that bad, but certainly they had the red light districts, and they certainly had lots of booze and lots of... gambling and everything else, and that was true. And again, today, race relations, I certainly don't want to make any profound observations about race relations in Memphis today, but if you look at race relations back then, Dewey was one of the few white people who could actually pull that off, I think. He actually, feeling that comfortable to be on Beale Street. I grew up in Memphis, of course, and I just never went, like most white people, just never went down on Beale Street, never frequented Beale Street. It was perfectly okay, apparently, for white people to be on Beale Street up to about 2nd or 3rd. In other words, you weren't too far off of Main Street. But the real juke joints and the real Beale Street really didn't get started until about 2nd or 3rd Street. So those last couple of blocks down there apparently were most of where the juke joints were.
Right, right.
And I got most of that from Peter Guralnick, who I think really knows that whole history best, the person who did the real 2-volume biography of Elvis, and his feeling was that he said Dewey was like somebody from outer space, and he just couldn't understand how he felt so comfortable on Beale Street.
Exactly. Well, I want to talk a little bit about Sam Phillips and Dewey, because, and if I've got this wrong, you straighten me out. Dewey's got his radio show and he's rocking along. Sam Phillips is cutting records, practically taking them off his recording whatever and hand delivering the record over to Dewey. So things are going with no promotion whatsoever from record making straight to the radio station. And if Dewey liked it, you were pretty much going to make it.
And you got it exactly right. That's just what he did. Sam had the old acetate machine in the Sun record shop. What they had, this of course is in the day before, he even had this in the days before tape was so widely disseminated that it was relatively cheap. One of the greatest stories about Sam is that he actually recorded over some of those early Elvis songs when Elvis made it big because he wanted to save the tapes because the tapes were expensive. And of course, an early Elvis song now would be worth millions.
The man just didn't know.
Didn't know. But Sam would record this on an acetate machine, and that was the master.
Yeah.
And then he would immediately take the master down to WHBQ and let Dewey play it in the big test. And if Dewey liked it, that was it. His favorite phrase was call Sam. Call Sam meant call Sam Phillips because this one's going to hit. And if he predicted a hit, they said if it hit in Memphis, if Dewey predicted it would be a hit, it would hit nationally. And sure enough, that's what happened most of the time. He didn't miss it very often. But he certainly got that reputation. So Sam and Dewey had that thing where he had that jump on everybody else at Sun Records. And that, I think, led to a lot of charges about payola and about some kind of hanky-panky going on with Sam and Dewey.
Right.
But there was really no need for that. There was really no need for that because, of course, most of the time, they complemented each other so well. I mean, Dewey was happy to get, you didn't have to pay Dewey anything. He felt great that he could introduce Elvis Presley. He could introduce Carl Perkins. He could introduce Johnny Cash. And to get played for the first time, Jerry Lee Lewis is going to be played on Dewey Phillips' show for the first time. Was a reward enough for him.
Exactly. Well, all right. What year did Dewey meet Elvis, and how old were they? Because they weren't the same age when they met.
No. Elvis, this is 1954, so Elvis would have been roughly about, when he hits, he's roughly, what is he born, 35, so he's like 19, is that right? He's 19. Dewey's already about 25, 26 years old. He's an older man.
Right.
And a lot of people are of the opinion that Elvis was lollygagging around down on Beale Street when he first arrives in Memphis and going into the juke joints and that sort of thing and getting the black music, but I don't know. And Peter Guralnick knows a lot more about this than I do, and Peter can't buy that story either. He says he thinks Elvis felt a lot more comfortable after he got his first record and went down there with Dewey Phillips. Dewey took Elvis down to most of those places. Dewey really introduced him to the juke joints on Beale Street and so on. I just don't, I can't imagine Elvis as a 13, 14-year-old kid arriving from Mississippi, suddenly going down. He was into the black music, no question about it.
He already had that.
When I brought him to the Goodwill Review, one of the first things I asked him was, did he listen to the station? Did he listen to WDIA? And he told me that he listened to WDIA all the time, loved the black music, not only the rhythm and blues, but the black gospel music as well, which was DIA played about half rhythm and blues and about half gospel. So he was already listening to the station, but I think there's a big difference between listening to the music on the radio and actually going into the black juke joints on Beale Street.
Right. Well, so Elvis and Dewey, now their careers are moving forward very quickly. Elvis goes on to Hollywood after his music hits big. Now he's making movies. I just want you to just sort of contrast Dewey with Elvis in Memphis and Dewey with Elvis in Hollywood, because he was different there.
He was different in Hollywood. Actually, that's when they first started, relations first started getting strained between Dewey and Elvis.
Yeah.
Dewey got bad at the end. He had several big automobile wrecks and messed up his leg very bad. He walked with that very obvious limp. And he took a lot of pain pills. Apparently he had tremendous pain all the time. They gave him sort of, the doctors, as I understand it, gave him an option of either having the leg amputated or having a lifetime of pain, and he chose to have a lifetime of pain. So he was already taking pain pills. He already had a reputation for being a bit of a boozer, and he started mixing, I think, the liquor and the pain pills, and it was just a toxic combination.
Absolutely.
He got very, very bad at the end, and everybody, including Elvis, finally had to turn on him. Elvis was wonderful toward Dewey at the end. I must say, to Elvis's everlasting credit, he and Sam Phillips tried desperately to help him out, but nobody could deal with Dewey at the end. And it all started in Hollywood, to answer your question. He went out to Hollywood. Elvis had him come out. going to show him all around. And of course, there's several incidents where they go to the Moulin Rouge or someplace, and they introduce Elvis, and Dewey is already drinking, stands up, and kind of takes the camera away from him.
I thought the Yul Brynner thing was like, oh my God, Dewey, shut up.
Yeah, the Yul Brynner story is that he said something to the effect that, he was awfully short, and Elvis felt terrible. Right to his face, and Elvis had to apologize for that. But he got very bad at the end, and Elvis continued to help Dewey even after he couldn't even deal with him, and Sam Phillips did the same thing. And this is, as I say, is to his everlasting credit, because at first, they were just simply trying to get some money to him because he was getting basically unemployed and, of course, getting in really bad shape.
He lost his TV show, lost the radio show. I mean, that was a crash, his total crash right then. After that,
And they tried to get some money to him, but, of course, what they were doing, this is in the days before we even had terms like enablers, but they were really enabling him. Of course, the money he took would just usually get spent up on the liquor. So
and I got the feeling that Memphis cops did that during those accident things too. But I don't know. So
that's right. That's right. He was so popular that nobody could say. And he and Elvis suffered that way, I think, too, in the same way toward the end.
On that note, because we're running out of time, I just wanted you to make a couple of parallels, because there were so many between the way Elvis's life went and Dewey's life, and their characters. Like, they both considered their mothers the most important person of all time ever, perhaps even before God. And then they were both extremely generous.
Exactly.
Other parallels.
Well, they both at the end had that trouble with the drugs. In the case of Elvis, of course,
men with so much to offer.
They couldn't. I don't think there was anybody around to say no. They had yes men around them all the time. It was very difficult. What are you going to say to Elvis Presley? You're going to say no to the king?
Yeah, no.
And the same was true with Elvis. Everyone just sort of pampered them. And of course, they needed some discipline at that point. They're really kind of tragic figures, both Elvis and Dewey, to be pitied, I think. This was in the days, of course, before detox programs and that sort of thing, and people just didn't quite know what to do with them. But they both had that quality of recognizing the goodness in people, promoting that, and I think that Dewey, they shared that characteristic trait for sure.
Absolutely. Now, before we close, I want you to tell us what you think Dewey Phillips' legacy and contribution to music history
Good Lord.
is.
That's a big one for a quick summary.
How about a minute?
I think the 2 points I made earlier, that one, that he really kind of legitimized the race music sound for the white mainstream audience. He made it mainstream. He really set the stage for Elvis.
Right.
I mean, Sam Phillips said, give me a white guy who can sound like a black guy, I'll make $1 zillion. Dewey had already kind of had the white folks listening to the black sound, and so Elvis just kicked right in on it. And the other major contribution is, as I have already emphasized, I think he was mostly responsible for really getting Elvis going in those early days before, when Elvis Presley nobody had ever heard of, Sam Phillips nobody had ever heard of. Dewey Phillips was the biggest name in the world.
Absolutely. Louis, thanks so much for a great read in Dewey and Elvis, and thanks for being with us today. If you love Elvis, the Memphis music scene, the history of rock and roll, then Dewey and Elvis is a book that will thrill you. We thank you for joining us today on Book Talk, and we'll see you next time.
You're watching the Library Channel, a broadcast service of the Memphis Public Libraries and the City of Memphis.